I am not a gift, cowboy, I am a warning. The chief sent me to you so you would leave these lands. The canteen was empty. I knew that before I unscrewed the lid. The weight of it told me, but I unscrewed it anyway, tipped it, held it upside down over my open mouth. One drop, tasted like tin and old leather. I set it on the rock beside me and looked out at what was left of the day. I had been following the Cimarron branch for 2 days and it kept lying to me. Dry bed, sand the color of old bone. The willows along the cut were dead from the roots up, which I'd never seen before, and I'd ridden through this country a dozen times since the war. Something had changed in the water table maybe, or maybe the land had just decided it was done. I understood the feeling. My name is Caleb Donahue. I was 53 years old that autumn, or I thought I was. I'd stopped keeping close track around 48, when it started to seem like the kind of information a man doesn't need to check too often. I'd ridden for the Army 12 years after the war, then spent 6 more trying to be a rancher in the Texas Panhandle, then gave that up when the drought came and the cattle bank closed. I was not riding anywhere in particular when I crossed into that territory. I had a letter in my saddlebag from a territorial judge in Tucson, asking me to look into some land disputes out on the flats near the New Mexico line. The judge owed me a favor, and I needed the work, and neither of those things felt like a real reason for anything. But a man rides somewhere, or he doesn't ride at all. My horse, a gray roan I called Ord short for nothing, just a name that fit him, had more sense than I did. He stopped twice in the last hour, lifted his head, turned his ears. I gave him the rein and let him choose the direction. He took us east and slightly south, away from the dry Cimarron cut, toward a low ridge I could see furred with cedar. Behind those cedars there was a seep, maybe 2 gallons pooled in a flat of clay, greenish at the edges, but I drunk worse. I got down and let Ord drink first, which I always did, and while he drank I heard movement in the trees above the seep and I didn't reach for my rifle. I don't know exactly why. Something in the quality of the sound, patient, not hurried. Whoever was up there had been watching me for a while. She came down through the cedars without any ceremony. She was Comanche. I could see that in the cut of her dress and the way she wore her hair, parted and braided, with a strip of red cloth worked into the left braid. Maybe 30 years old, maybe a few more. She walked like someone who'd been walking difficult ground since before she could remember, and she stopped about 12 feet from me and looked at me without any expression I could name. She said, in English that was better than most of the men I'd worked with, "I am not a gift, cowboy. I am a warning. The chief sent me to you so you would leave these lands." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "What chief?" "Essahavy." I'd heard that name. He ran a band, maybe 60 people, out of the mesas to the north. They weren't supposed to be in this territory anymore, according to the government, which meant exactly nothing to me, but it was the kind of information that explained a few things. I said, "I've got no quarrel with Essahavy. You ride for the men who have surveyed this canyon." "I ride for a judge in Tucson. I'm looking into land disputes. I don't know anything about a survey." She watched me the way you watch a dog you're not sure about, trying to read whether the growl means anything real. I said, "What's your name?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Nupa." I said, "All right, Nupa. I'm going to fill this canteen and I'm going to ask you something and you can answer or not." I crouched down at the seep and filled the canteen. The water was cold. Good sign. I said, "These men who surveyed the canyon, where are they camped?" She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Why?" "Because if they're working a fraud on government land, the judge will want to know about it. That's a different thing from me helping them." She watched me stand up and cap the canteen and hang it back on the saddle. I could feel her thinking, not deciding whether to trust me, she wasn't there yet, just deciding whether the next thing I said was worth her time. She said, "There are 7 of them. They have a camp at the mouth of the Red Canyon, 2 days' ride from here if you go the long way. Half a day if you go through Essahavy's territory." I said, and Essa Havey would let me ride through. He would let you ride through with me. I thought about that. I said, why would Essa Havey send you out here as a warning and then offer me a guide? She said, because I told him I would look at you first. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, he listens to me. I believed her. There was something about the way she said it, not pride, just a plain fact she'd lived long enough to stop being surprised by. We rode through Essa Havey's territory the next morning. I'd spent the night on the flat below the cedar ridge, wrapped in my bedroll, listening to Nupa build a small fire about 40 yards from my camp. She didn't invite me to it, and I didn't go. In the morning she was up before me, had her horse saddled, a short, hard-muscled paint with a wall eye, and was eating something from a cloth bag without looking at me. She showed me the way through a canyon I would never have found on my own. Narrow, full of shadow, the walls close enough in places that my boots brushed the stone on both sides. Petroglyphs on the south wall, old ones. I didn't mention them and she didn't either, but I saw her eyes go to them as we passed. We came out onto a high mesa with a long view north and west. The mesas out there were the color of dried blood in the afternoon light. She said without turning, my husband died 4 years ago, fever. My son is 8 years old and lives with my mother's family. I didn't know what to do with that. I said, I'm sorry about your husband. She said, I am telling you so you understand why I can do this, why I have the time. I understand. We were quiet for a while, riding across the mesa. She said, you have a wife. I said, no, not for a long time. What happened to her? I thought about that, I said. She decided she'd rather be somewhere else. I don't blame her. I was gone more than I was there. Nupa was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was wrong to leave. I looked at her. She was looking ahead at the trail. She said, a man who goes out and comes back is not the same as a man who never goes out. You can see the difference. I didn't answer. I don't know that I had an answer. It landed somewhere in my chest and I just let it sit there. Essa Havey's camp was set in a meadow at the head of the canyon, in the shade of 3 huge cottonwoods that had no business being alive in that country, and yet there they were, green and enormous and rattling in a light wind. There were maybe 20 people visible, horses on a picket line, a smell of cedar smoke and something being cooked over a low fire. Essa Havey himself came out to meet us. He was older than I expected, maybe 65, lean as wire, with gray at his temples and eyes that had the particular quality of a man who's been watching things carefully for a long time and has reached the point where he's mostly done being surprised. He looked at me for what felt like a full minute without saying anything. I stayed on Ord and I didn't move. Then he looked at Nupa and said something in Comanche. She answered. He looked at me again. He said in English, she says you are honest. I said, I don't know that I'm always honest. I try to be fair. He thought about that. He said, that is better. He gestured toward the fire, and I got down from Ord. We ate. Nupa sat beside me, not touching, not performing anything, just sat beside me. And when one of the men across the fire said something and looked at me with a half smile, she said something back, quick and dry, and the man stopped smiling. I asked her later what he'd said. She said, he said you look like a man who has lost something and is still looking for it. I said, what did you say back? She said, I said that is not the same as being lost. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked at the fire. She said, it is not the same thing. I know she was talking about me. I don't know what I felt exactly. Not soft. Not like something being given to me I didn't deserve. More like someone had looked at a thing in me I'd stopped looking at myself and called it by its real name, and the name turned out to be something I could live with. In the morning, Essa Havey showed me a map he'd drawn himself, on a piece of dried hide, of the canyon the survey crew was working. He showed me where the original territorial markers stood and where the survey flags had been placed 50, 60 yards inside the established boundary. It was a clean fraud, the kind that depends on nobody with authority ever riding out to look. I had paper in my saddlebag, and I copied the map as best I could. Esahavi watched me do it and said nothing. When I was done, he said, "You will send this to the judge." "I'll write it to the judge myself. Paper gets lost." He looked at me again with that long, particular look. Then he nodded. Nupa rode with me to the edge of Esahavi's territory. It was mid-morning. The sun was still low enough that the shadows ran long ahead of us, and the air was cold in a way that meant the season was turning for real, not just threatening to. Where the canyon opened out onto the flats, she stopped her paint, and I stopped Ord, and we sat there for a moment. She said, "When you have done this thing with the judge." I said, "Yes." She said, "Esahavi will want to know the outcome. Someone should bring word." I said, "Is that the only reason someone should come back?" She looked at me then. Not a long look, just a moment of full, straight attention. Then she looked forward again at the flats and the long distance. She said no. That was all. I took it for what it was, which was more than I'd been handed in a long time. I touched my hat brim and I rode out onto the flats. What I found at the mouth of the Red Canyon turned out to be worse than a simple survey fraud. There were 7 men, as Nupa said. 3 of them I recognized, not by name, but by type. The kind who take a job from whoever's paying and don't look too hard at what the job is doing. The other 4 were rougher. The kind who take a job and enjoy the parts that can't be written in the contract. They had 2 Comanche men tied to a wagon wheel at the edge of the camp. Both of them had been there a while. I could see that from 30 yards out. Neither one was conscious. I sat on Ord at the edge of their camp for a long moment and looked at what I was seeing. A man came out of the main tent with a cup of coffee. He looked up and saw me and stopped. I said, "Who's the boss of this outfit?" He called a name. A bigger man came out, well-dressed for the circumstances, which told me something. He had the look of a man who spent a lot of time convincing himself that what he's doing is simply business. He said, "Who are you?" I said, "Caleb Donahue. I carry an appointment from Judge Halford in Tucson. I'm here to inspect your survey work." He smiled the way men smile when they think they know what's about to happen. He said, "Happy to show you our papers." I said, "You can show me those. You can also explain those 2 men tied to your wagon." The smile changed. What happened over the next 2 hours I will not lay out entirely because most of it is not the point. It involved a pistol that got drawn, not mine, and a piece of wagon timber I picked up off the ground and used to considerable effect. It involved a conversation that got very quiet and very clear, the kind of clarity that arrives when someone understands that the man across from them is not going to move. When it was over, the 2 Comanche men were cut loose. One of them could walk. I got the other one onto my horse and walked him north myself. It took most of the day to get back to the edge of Esahavi's territory. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I was following the canyon north and hoping someone was watching, which turned out to be a reasonable assumption. 2 riders came off the ridge an hour before dark, and they knew the man I had across my saddle, and they took him from me. I sat on a rock while they talked among themselves, and my legs recovered. One of the riders came back to me and said something I didn't understand. I spread my hands. He thought for a moment and then said, in careful English, "Nupa will want to know you are here." I said, "I'll be here." She came at dusk. I was sitting by a fire I'd built in a hollow off the canyon trail, feeding it the small dry sticks that don't make much smoke. I heard her horse before I saw her, the paint's particular tread, that slight favoring of the right front that I'd noticed the first day. She came into the firelight and looked at me, and her face went through something. Not dramatic, just a quick, honest thing that she let be visible before she put it back. She said, "They told me what you did." I said, I didn't do anything complicated. She said, you brought Suru home. I said, I didn't know his name. She sat down across the fire from me. She looked at my hands. I had a cut along the right one, not deep from the timber. She looked at it for a moment, then looked up at my face. She said, you could have left them. I said, no. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no, I don't think you could have. She reached into the bag on her hip and took out a piece of cloth and something from a small tin. She came around the fire and crouched beside me and took my right hand and began to clean the cut. Her hands were steady and competent, and she didn't make a production of it. It was just a thing that needed doing, and she did it. I sat there and let her. After a moment she said, without looking up from my hand, Esahavi says you are welcome in this territory. I said, tell him I'm grateful. She said, he said to tell you that a man who does what you did does not need to be grateful. He said to tell you. She stopped for a moment, finding the right words, or maybe deciding how much to give me. He said to tell you that his people have not met many men who make them change their minds about men. I looked at the fire. I said, that's a hard thing to receive. She said, yes. She tied off the cloth and held my hand for a moment without saying anything. Then she set it down on my knee and sat back and looked at me across the firelight. She said, you will still go to Tucson. I said, I have to. The judge needs the map and the testimony, but it won't take long, 2 weeks, maybe 3. She looked at me. In that firelight, the way it moved across her face, the quiet directness of her eyes, I knew she was looking at me and seeing what I was, not what I'd been. Not what was worn out or used up or left behind somewhere in the years. What I was right then, whatever that amounted to. She said, my son's name is Tossipin. It means redbird. I said, that's a good name. She said, he would like to meet you. I held that for a moment. The weight of it, the ordinary plainness of it, the thing it meant. I said, I'd like that. She nodded once like something was settled. She stood and went back to her horse. At the edge of the firelight she paused and said, without turning, come back before the first snow. I said, I will. She rode back up into the dark, and I sat by the fire for a long time after. I rode to Tucson and I gave the judge his map and his testimony. The survey crew was arrested inside 2 weeks, the well-dressed man first, then the others one by one as they tried to scatter. The 2 Comanche men's names went into the court record, which took some doing, but I pressed for it, and the judge was a fair man when pressed. I was back in Esahavi's territory before the first snow, 2 weeks before if I'm being exact. I wanted some margin. Tossipit was a serious boy with his mother's eyes, and a habit of watching you for a long time before he said anything. The first day he watched me from a distance. The second day he came and looked at Ord up close, and I lifted him up and let him sit in the saddle, and he held the reins like he'd been doing it for years. His mother stood back and watched and didn't say anything, but I felt her watching and I understood what she was reading and what she saw, and I was glad she was reading it. That evening Esahavi came and sat with me by the fire and we didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The fire was good. The night was cold and clear and going to get colder, and above the canyon rim the stars were doing what stars do out there, which is more than anywhere else I've ever been. After a while Esahavi said, you will stay through the winter. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a command either. It was the kind of thing a man says when he is giving you something he's already decided to give. I said yes. He nodded. He poked the fire once with a stick and watched the sparks go up, and then he said something in Comanche that I didn't understand, and I didn't ask him to translate it. Some things you understand without the words. Nupa and I were married in the spring, in the Comanche way, and then in the other way too because she wanted both and I wasn't about to argue. Tossipit stood beside me when it was done, which was not a tradition in either direction but which neither party objected to. He came up to about my elbow. He looked up at me, and then looked ahead, and I looked ahead too, at his mother, who was looking at me with an expression I will not try to describe beyond saying that I had not been looked at that way in longer than I could measure, and that I had not known until that moment how much I had been carrying the weight of its absence. She stepped forward and put both her hands on my chest, flat, the way you feel for a heartbeat. She looked up at me. She said quietly, so only I could hear, "You are not a man anyone should have overlooked." I put my hands over hers. I don't know what I said, if I said anything. I think I didn't. Some things don't need an answer. You just hold them and let the weight of them tell you what they're worth. I am 61 now, or near enough. We run a small operation on land the territorial court awarded. There is some satisfaction in that, though the fight over it wasn't simple. And Tossipet, who is 13, can work a horse better than men twice his age and reads better than I ever did and has opinions about everything. Nupa teaches at a school 2 days a week in a town I won't name, and is treated with more respect than she ought to have to earn, and earns it anyway. Evenings we sit on the step. The light out here in the hour before dark does a thing I don't have words for, goes red and then gold and then a kind of deep, still orange that I used to ride through without stopping to look. I stop now. She leans against my shoulder. I feel her weight, familiar as anything I own. The canteen on that clay seep. The cedars and the cold water, Ord turning his ears toward the ridge. I have thought about it enough times to know I don't believe in accidents. That doesn't mean I believe in providence either. I believe in a horse with more sense than his rider, and a woman who came down through the trees and said what she was, plainly, without apology, and looked at a man she didn't know yet and decided to look at him straight. You can't put a value on that. You just carry it forward and let it be worth what it's worth.